Hi, I'm Steve Cilenti, and with me today is Sheriff Gary Kuntz of the Calaveras County Sheriff's Department. Today we've got a interesting but a very, I'll say, complex discussion. We're going to be talking about home evasion. I think one of the things that the Sheriff and I both agree on, that this is an area that there is no way for either of us to give you specific legal advice about a situation that you may be in, that every situation is different, every situation is fact-based, and you change one fact and the result may change. Is that correct, Sheriff?
That's correct.
Both the Sheriff and I come from law enforcement backgrounds. I went on to become an attorney, and the Sheriff went on to become the Sheriff. So we've got an extensive experience and background in this area, but again, it's a real tough area of law. Sheriff, have you been in a situation in the county as the sheriff, or before you became sheriff, where you have had cause to investigate the crime of home invasion?
Yes. I think as far as home invasion, probably 6, 7 cases.
Okay. They're not as typical here as we hear in more metropolitan areas, correct?
That's correct.
Now, home invasion, as I've always understood it, certainly implies that someone has entered your home, whether it's daytime or nighttime, and they're there to do you bodily harm. Is that
correct?
Pretty much what you've seen?
Yes.
The law makes a distinction between someone forcibly entering your home and someone just trespassing, correct?
Correct.
And again, we need to make this real clear that we're talking about home evasion here, because the law presumes certain rights that you have as a homeowner if someone enters your home to commit bodily harm, correct?
Correct.
Are there any cases you in particular, or come to mind, or situations that come to mind that the viewers may be interested in?
Yes, I remember once, this was quite a while back, probably approximately, I'd say 12 to 15 years ago. I was a sergeant in charge of investigations, and we had a subject down the Hogan Dam who lived across the street from one of these campgrounds, and it happened quite real early in the morning. This gentleman who was in a campground was, I think he was loaded up on crank and a few other things, and he come across the street, banged on the door, and told me he wanted in, kicked the door open, came in there with a wheel and a knife, a large hunting knife. And the guy immediately, when he started banging the door, went in and got his, it was a 44 Bulldog. I remember it was the same one son of Sam used to shoot his people with, and he had it, and he told the guy to get out of his house, and the guy become more violent and kept getting closer at him, threatened he's going to kill him. And he took another step, and the guy shot him and killed him there right on the spot. And, he didn't move around or nothing. I mean, he hit him 5X center mass and dropped the guy right there. And I remember us going to that scene, and I had a lieutenant then who, and I was, normally you would just, if it was justifiable or not, you thought in your own mind you always took the person in, not necessarily in handcuffs, but you took him in to question him and whatnot. And this lieutenant just shook his hand and said, good shooting, you defend you and your wife. And we got it from here. We did the scene and left. That one always stuck in my mind because it was kind of different,
In getting ready for the show, both you and I have taken a look at the law in this area, and I think we both agree. In fact, the law says that when you act in self-defense in your own home, it is merely a defense, which means that you're in court, and that is your defense.
Right.
This is not a situation where you tell the officer what happened and they say, okay, and they leave. That's not necessarily what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Right.
You're right.
Well, it has happened, certainly, that the officer has the ability to and makes a decision on the spot whether or not to arrest. They're not the ultimate determiner of whether or not that case proceeds on to trial, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What is the general process? And I think it applies on whether it's a home invasion case or any other case where there's been a violation or suspected violation of crime. What happens after the sheriff's office gets involved?
Then again, like you said, depending on the situation, the officer gets there, and then, of course, a few more show up, and then some detectives come out, and the supervisor comes out there, and sometimes even, a captain or even myself would come out there toward the end, and they sit around and talk about it and everything else. And I think the very least that I'm sheriff now, that we would take the subject in, the shooter in, or the trigger guy, or the guy that pulled the trigger, take him in and at least interview him at the sheriff's office. At that point in time, I would contact the DA's office, have a DA investigator come over there, or even the DA herself come over there, and we would talk about it and decide what we want to do with this individual. And I don't think everybody needs to be booked, but they definitely need to be brought in and talked to, and look at the evidence and the crime scene and make a determination whether the subject, we will let them go or not.
So the first step, of course, is to do as thorough of an investigation as possible.
That's correct.
And at that point, involving the DA, who would have essentially the next step in the process of making that determination whether or not there needs to be more investigation, or to certainly consider whether or not to file any charges. Is that right?
That's right.
That's not the filing of charges is not a sheriff function.
That is correct.
A lot of people misunderstand that and believe that if a sheriff arrests you or doesn't arrest you, that could be the end of or is the end of the story, and it really is not.
That's right.
It goes to the DA's office. They make the final decision. And then the next step in the process, of course, is that a complaint gets filed in court. Although we do have the process of a grand jury indictment, we don't see that very often anymore.
No, you're right.
Okay. Now, in looking at whether it's home invasion or any other crime, once the case gets to the courts, except for the perhaps testimony, the law enforcement or further investigation, law enforcement is pretty much out of it at that point, and it proceeds on to the courts. What a lot of people believe is that the courts have a lot of control over the case, where in fact the courts deal with the law. But ultimately, because this is a defense, it is up to a jury to make a decision. And I don't remember, Sheriff, did you work in a metropolitan area at some point?
No, I did my whole career right here.
Okay. I worked in Sacramento, a little bit different situation, both Redding and Sacramento in law enforcement. But what you may see in Calaveras County, the process, the laws are the same, the process are essentially the same, but I would venture to say that metropolitan juries are a little different than this county.
That's very correct.
Okay. So once the case gets to the DA's office and a complaint is charged, the DA is going to be looking, as will you during the course of your investigation, various factors to determine initially during the investigation whether or not this is what we refer to as a justifiable homicide. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What are some of the things that you would look for in the investigation, or have your investigators look for, to determine whether or not this is just a homicide or a manslaughter, or in fact possibly a situation where a person may have a defense of justifiable homicide? Well,
first of all, you get on the scene. If you had any witnesses, you definitely want to explore that, interview them, and maybe do a little quick background check on your suspect or your deceased, and also the person that shot this person himself, and look, listen to their stories and go back and look on the scene and make sure it kind of matches up to what he's saying, and make sure, like I never forget, the longest I can remember is that there was an old saying that if you shot somebody outside, drag him inside, it'll make it look like, then you're clear. Remember? I get that more and more from everybody else, but that's probably the most ridiculous thing to do, because then you definitely gonna make yourself look guilty. So yeah, you just look at the crime scene, possibly the victim, witnesses around, and the backgrounds of both subjects, and and the crime scene itself will tell you a lot. It's by looking at what what the shooter says, what happened, and you go back and take a look. And if you're a pretty seasoned homicide investigator, you can pretty much start picking up on those pieces, blood spatters, where blood went and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of factors contributing to that. So that's what we would look for.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we often hear is a lot of questioning about whether or not the person was afraid when this bad person came into the home, whether they were afraid of imminent death, when in fact on a home invasion, when you're protecting your own home, that's not even necessary.
Right.
Just the fact that somebody comes into your home, in fact, the law presumes, and is when the wide-angle shot, you can see I've got my books in front of me because it's such a very delicate area. The law presumed the defendant reasonably feared imminent death or great bodily injury to himself or to a member of their family or household. So fear is not necessary. For instance, I know you had a recent situation at your house. I've had one in mine in the past, where as law enforcement officers, certainly you may be anxious, perhaps afraid, but not the same as some citizen who's never been faced with a situation. But when you're protecting your own home, you don't need to be afraid.
That's correct.
You don't have to, the law presumes that fear is there.
Right.
All right? And so if you've acted in a calculating way because of your training, it doesn't make any difference. So,
that's right.
You have a right to protect your own home. But one of the other key factors is, as I indicated, that you're there to protect yourself and a member of your family, all right, or household. So in other words, if someone is there and they have reason to believe that a visitor who is in their own home is about to be attacked, they have the same right to protect that household member, correct?
That's correct.
All right. The law, when you're looking at home invasion, does draw some distinctions. We may see a situation where a person, in an attempt to protect themselves in their own home, is faced with the possibility of violence by another family member. That's a different defense.
That's
correct?
Right. That's correct.
Can you tell me the difference of what could happen if it was a family member you're protecting yourself from, a spouse, aunt, uncle, whomever, versus like the home invasion?
Well, yeah, it's the home invasion is basically a stranger to you, and they're coming in, and that automatically kind of probably kicks up the stress level a little bit, because now you have someone entering your home who you don't have a clue who it is. You don't know if he's there to harm you or take some of your property. What's he armed with, versus a family member or cohabitant or something in your own home, and they come home, for a hypothetical situation, they come home drunk and they've been having a lot of problems, and maybe the male or female has a history of domestic violence, and finally, they get carried away a little too much, and a lot of pushing, shoving going on, throwing things, and all of a sudden somebody gets punched in the face, and somebody grabs a gun or a knife and sticks him or shoots him. Now that one there is a lot more difficult to work with than your basic stranger coming into your home, because it takes a lot, and a lot of investigation, and it makes it harder for the DA to decide what to charge them with, and it's tougher for juries too, I think.
And the difference between a home invasion, where you've got a person arguably that's unknown to you, versus a family member, could be a neighbor, someone you know, One of the things that I've heard differently in our little discussion here is that in one situation, unlike a home invasion, there may be consent for the person to enter your home.
That's correct.
And that does change the situation.
That's right.
Under the law, an intruder who unlawfully and forcibly enters or was entering the defendant's home. When we say defendant's home, that's because the homeowner is being charged. That's why we call them a defendant. Mm-hmm. Here you've got a forcible entry versus a consent. So the law on justifiable homicide and a home invasion begins to diverge from just plain self-defense at this point.
That's correct.
But there are situations that, in fact, where a person may be defending themselves, whether they're in their home or not, and they do have a right to protect their own life. Is that right?
That's right.
Right. And then next aspect that the DA will first look at, and ultimately a jury will have to decide, is whether or not the defendant knew or reasonably believed that an intruder unlawfully and forcibly entered or was entering the defendant's home. Here we go back to the consent issue versus somebody that kicks in the door, climbs through a window. Now, under the law, when we talk about forcibly enter a person's home, this does not mean necessarily kicking in the door, correct?
Right.
And based on your experience, what force in entering a home could include what?
As far as, well, you could have the doors unlocked summer evening. You got your screen door, they just walk in, or a lot of times they're in a house and you walk in the house already there. And so, it varies from case to case on what may happen.
But that is one of the aspects that law enforcement would look for, as to whether or not there was uninvited or unconsented entry.
Yeah, you're right.
Now, in researching this for today, there are very few cases actually in the area of home invasion. But one of the distinctions I found is that if someone's in for instance, a carport or in your front yard, they haven't forcibly entered the physical dwelling, but certainly you're trespassing, that you do not have the same rights to defend yourself as you would if they were in your own home.
Oh, that's very correct. That's very true.
So you may have a defense, but it certainly won't be to protect yourself from any home invasion, because none has happened at that point. And when we're talking about the domestic violence situation versus home invasion, a clear distinction is that the intruder is not a family member.
Right.
All right. Now, we've heard of situations in law enforcement where you're confronted with the problem where someone says, I heard a strange noise in the middle of the night, I saw a shadow, I took my firearm and I shot. And it turned out to be another family member. That's not included in this defense.
That's right.
So it's got to be a non-family member.
Right.
Right? I don't know if you've ever had that experience where that in fact has happened or not.
Me personally, no. I think the only thing I remember is somebody hit somebody with a baseball bat or something like that, but I don't remember anybody getting shot over it.
Well, we have talked about people getting shot. This, obviously for law enforcement, is a very touchy subject. I think you and I both agree that if you own a firearm, unless you intend to actually use it, it's not a weapon to be threatened with, because if you haven't made that decision that you could actually use that, you may have created a situation far worse for yourself.
That's right. No, that's very true, and that's one of the reasons I don't have a problem giving out concealed weapon permits to people, because if they're eligible for them. But what the best part about that is they have to go to special training. They have to learn how to use a firearm and everything else. And there's a lot, like I say, there's a lot of people that go buy firearms, don't shoot them, they're not familiar with them, and then all of a sudden it's kind of more of a psychological comfort to them. But like you said, when they come time to use them, and if you're not mentally set for that, I mean, I remember when I was a young cop, I would go out and I would have had to say to myself every night, if I had to use deadly force, could I pull it out, aim it, and shoot it, or stop someone? And that was, I used to go through that little exercise for a long time, because, it was either, so That's very true what you're saying. Is sometimes they could take it away from you. They could, and then things go downhill real quick.
I've even seen, and you perhaps have also seen situations where law enforcement officers pulled out a firearm and then realized that they had no justification to use it. Suddenly they've got something in their hand they've got to get rid of.
That's right.
Because they, in fact, have elevated the situation where that could result in further bodily harm to them in the use of their own weapon because they've drawn it. And putting a holster back in your, or a gun back in your holster in a tense situation is not an easy task.
No, it's not. No, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole.
Absolutely, that holster gets really small.
That's right.
All right. One of the, I remember going through a police oral when I first started Reading Police Department, and they did pose a situation, and this again is a law enforcement context rather than home invasion, that if it came down to it, and you had exhausted all other means, could you pull that trigger? I don't know if you had a similar question when you started in this business.
No, I never had that question, no.
It took a lot of thought.
Oh, yeah, it does.
Because that is a big decision that anybody, especially going to law enforcement, has to make. While in my experience in law enforcement, I never had occasion to pull that trigger. Glad that I didn't. But it is a very difficult decision, and for a citizen, it's even worse.
That's correct.
They don't have the training to make that determination. Now, law enforcement does go through specific training regarding shoot, don't shoot situations, correct?
That's correct.
And can you talk about a little bit what that kind of training is?
Our department has probably done this 3 times. We brought up a big simulator where they use those like plastic bullets, and they would have a screen, and they'd put you there, and they run you through some scenarios to shoot or not shoot. And it was a, you get in there, and this thing shot back at you too, by the way, and it hit you too. And it's pretty nerve-wracking, it really was. I mean, you go out into a firing range, you go through, combat shooting and that kind of thing. But when you're there and you have live videos and they're realistic and they're, they're full size, people in the videos are full size, and they can, when they shoot at you, they actually, there's a little gun that shoots back and hits you. And it stings like heck too. But anyways, it's really opens your mind to, and there's been a lot of officers that shot innocent people on those videos. So really open your mind.
And certainly a citizen does not have that kind of training that a law enforcement officer go through. In many cases, well, now you have to get a certificate of eligibility to be able to get a firearm, but to have it in your home, most people don't do any further training except that they minimally have to do. They're not faced with the same type of prospective situation as a law enforcement officer. So it's a very big decision to use or even have a firearm in your home. And of course, if you have kids, you better have a good, safe location. Lock that gun up.
That's a good point. I was just going to bring that up. Good point.
Because children don't have the same mental processes that we adults have, and maybe in some cases they have more, but we will get there. Under the law, one of the last factors that a jury looks at under the law is the defendant must use force intended to or likely to cause death or great bodily injury to the intruder inside of the home. Now again, this is the citizen who was in their own home. They've shot and killed somebody. That's one of the things that the jury is going to look at if they use force intended likely to commit great bodily injury. And certainly, I think it can be assumed if you pull out a firearm, even a knife, a baseball bat, any of those things, that you use some type of physical force and it's going to cause great bodily injury. So that is part of what you would look at in an investigation, correct?
Correct.
Again, this is a real tough area of law, but if there was any advice that you as a sheriff, knowing what you'd have to go through investigation or direct your people to do, and in anticipation of this case winding its way through the courts, is there any particular advice that you can apply to all situations, if that is possible, that we could tell the citizens as far as defending our own home?
You know, first of all, if you have a weapon, firearm, shotgun, rifle, whatever, make sure you know how to use it. And also that, and again, it's hard because the situation is different. If you see someone, you have the time to tell them to get out or stop or whatever. Do that first before you just arbitrarily pull the trigger. Now that subject is mentally handicapped or something, and it keeps coming towards you. You know, or best thing is if you can go somewhere and hide and call 911 or whatever. But if it happens where you're there, the gun's nearby. Some people leave the guns out there or on your nightstand. They come out, there he is or there she is, and you give them the warning, and they keep coming to you, and they're, you know, then you're really fearful of your life. Then you know that you need to do what you need to do.
And I don't disagree with that. And even though it may not be required in the law that you give a warning, it's not. It certainly is not required that you try to hide or seek to escape. That's not required.
Right.
But I do agree that if you don't have the training, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Yes.
Although some people would say, I'd rather trust a jury of 12 than one person who may be there to take my life. That is not necessarily the best approach.
No, I mean, I hear that expression a lot. I'd rather be tried by 12 than carried by 6, you know, and that kind of thing. But, you know, not only that, but when you take someone's life, even though you're justified doing it, it has a certain psychological effect that you carry on the rest of your life. And you know, on TV, they see people shooting other people, and it's not a big deal. But, you know, if you're a citizen of sound mind, it's definitely going to have an impact on you later on.
Over the years, I've dealt with a lot of officers who've had the occasion to shoot or actually take someone's life, and it's rough on them. Even though it's just fully justified under the law, many of them go on to have severe problems afterwards.
Could be a year or two later. You know, you're right. So it's, you know, if you can do something different, you know, I would try something different. But if you have a situation where they got you cornered or whatever, and you just have to resort to stopping somebody, we always tell us to say stop them, then you need to do so. And a lot of it depends on, you know, it's funny, a lot of it depends on size and stuff for the person. You know, you know, you're some big 6'7" guy, you know, stand there and some, you know, teenagers do a lot of burglaries, you know, and then you surprise them, teenager or something like that, and you shoot them, you're going to have a hard time proving that one. You're going to have a time proving that one.
Again, it's very fact-based.
Right.
When I was posing this question among my staff, and I brought up a situation, you wake up in the middle of the night, someone is advancing up the stairs, clearly it's a threat, you believe you see a firearm or some type of weapon in their hand, can you shoot him? And of course his response was yes. And then I said, the person is 8 years old.
That's right.
Change one fact, you change the
right.
answer.
That's right. You're
So
exactly right.
I think the important thing, again, for citizens, as you mentioned, that if you can get to a phone, immediately call 911, listen to your dispatchers. They're trained to deal with various situations.
Very correct.
And certainly, if you have any type of weapon and law enforcement is en route, make sure the dispatcher knows that you're armed, because you too could be in the situation where you're up against the officers. They don't know who the bad person is.
Right.
They only know that they see somebody with a firearm.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, this is a complex subject. We've kind of gone around a little bit. It's not someone that we can recommend you go talk to a lawyer ahead of time. Think before you act is the best advice that I could give you.
Same here.
Thank you for joining us today. you hadn't never